Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. My name is Marianne and on this channel I talk about geopolitical challenges. And today I want to talk about Taiwan. How it became this self-governing island that we know today, what it is doing to prevent an invasion of its island by China, and what China is preparing to do, and overall what are the options for the defense of the island. 160 kilometers. That's all that separates Taiwan from mainland China. A narrow stretch of water, calm on the surface, but crowded with cargo ships, fighter jets, submarines, and missiles that now concentrates more military power than almost any place in the world. On one side, there is a self-governing island of 23 million people, democratic, industrial, and deeply embedded in the global economy, and on the other, the People's Republic of China, a one-party state of 1.4 billion people, led by a leadership that considered Taiwan's existence outside of its control a historical aberration. For decades, this tension was managed, frozen by ambiguity and caution, but today Beijing's ambition to get Taiwan under its control is changing the peaceful status quo. It is not simply a dispute over sovereignty. It is a test of whether such an imperialistic war can still be deterred, contained, and even survived once it begins. The root of the Taiwan issue lies with China's civil war. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces took control of the mainland, and the defeated nationalist government fled to Taiwan, maintaining the name Republic of China. For years, both sides claimed to represent all of China. But with China's growing strength on the world stage, the world gradually recognized Beijing. In 1971, Taiwan lost its seat at the United Nations, and in 1979, the United States switched diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China while preserving unofficial ties with Taipei. Taiwan was left diplomatically isolated, but politically transformed. From the late 80s onward, the island democratized, instauring free elections, free press, alternation of power, and what was once a authoritarian refuge becoming one of Asia's most stable and thriving democracies. But for Beijing, Taiwan is an unresolved chapter of Chinese history. China's claim on Taiwan rests on the principle of one China, enshrined in law, doctrine, and national mythology. But Taiwan's own historical experience complicates this narrative. The island was successfully inhabited by indigenous people, colonized by Europeans, ruled by the Dutch, governed by Imperial China, and then by Japan from 1895 to 1945. The People's Republic of China and its governing Chinese Communist Party has never administered Taiwan. Today, identity surveys tell a clear story. In the early 1990s, most Taiwanese identified both as Chinese and Taiwanese, but today over 70% identify as Taiwanese only, and fewer than 3% identify as exclusively Chinese. This trend is even stronger amongst the younger generations. For Beijing, this trend is alarming. For Taipei, it is the political foundation of resistance. Taiwan has become something rare in the Chinese-speaking world, a prosperous, pluralistic democracy, proof that political modernity does not require authoritarian control. And that example is likely seen as a threat to Beijing. So under Xi Jinping, mainland China's current ruler, Taiwan has moved from a long-term aspiration to a strategic priority. Xi's signature concept, which is the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, frames reunification as both inevitable and necessary. The Anti-Secession Law of 2005 commits China to using force if Taiwan formally declares independence. And since 2012, the People's Liberation Army, mainland China's army, has been reshaped accordingly. China now has over 100 modern combat aircraft, the world's largest navy by ship count, extensive missile forces designed to deny access to foreign militaries. These capabilities form what strategists call A2AD, anti-access area denial, aimed at keeping the US and allied forces away from the theater. The PLA is not perfect, it still faces weaknesses in amphibious operations, submarine stealth, and combat experience. And amphibious invasions are notoriously difficult to conduct successfully. But this trajectory is unmistakable. In a potential war across the Taiwan Strait, China would arrive with an overwhelming number of ships, aircraft, and troops. Taiwan cannot realistically hope to match that strength symmetrically. Instead, Taiwan is adopting asymmetric options, a set of strategies and capabilities designed to exploit China's vulnerabilities and turn Taiwan's geography, technology, and society into force multipliers. At the center of this thinking is what is called the porcupine strategy. Rather than seeking to dominate China militarily, Taiwan aims to make itself so difficult and costly to invade that Beijing would hesitate to even attempt it. The objective would not be to destroy China's military outright, but to deny access, survive the initial wave attack, and then steadily bleed an invading force until the campaign becomes politically and militarily untenable. The first layer of this defense is sea denial and anti access. The Taiwan Strait would become the most dangerous obstacle China must cross. Land based anti ship cruise missiles hidden in the mountains, tunnels, and urban areas would be used to strike Chinese warships before they reach the shore. Maritime mines would quietly transform likely invasion routes into floating minefields, slowing amphibious forces and forcing them into predictable, vulnerable corridors. Diesel submarines and unmanned underwater vehicles would add a stealthy threat beneath the surface, stretching China's anti submarine defense and complicating its invasion. Survivability would be the second pillar. Taiwan would not expect to win in the first opening exchange of fire, but it would need to endure it. Mobile dispersed missile units would constantly relocate, making them extremely difficult to find and destroy. Large stocks of anti ship and surface to air missiles would ensure that even after heavy bombardment, Taiwan could continue to contest the air and sea. A layered air defense network would integrate radars, interceptors, and mobile launchers to shoot down aircrafts, drones, and missiles, preserving the forces needed to fight on. Instead of massed formations, small dispersed units would operate from hardened positions with portable anti armor, anti air weapons. Urban terrain would be treated as a fortress where every street, building, and tunnel would become a battlefield. Even if Chinese forces reach the cities, they would face a prolonged fight that would deny them a quick victory. Unmanned systems and precision fires form a third layer. Drones will provide persistent surveillance over the strait and the beaches, identifying landing forces and guiding strikes. Mobile rocket artillery would deliver precision fires against ports, staging areas, and logistic hubs, disrupting China's ability to sustain the invasion. The goal would not only be to stop the landing, but to make resupply and reinforcement nearly impossible. The battle would likely also extend into the invisible domains of cyber and electronic warfare. Taiwan would seek to degrade China's command and control and target systems through cyber operations and electronic attacks. Jamming radars, disrupting communications, and feeding false data would force the PLA, the Chinese army, to operate blind and confused. Deception and camouflage would compel China to waste extensive precision munitions on decoy and empty positions, buying Taiwan time and preserving its real combat power. But asymmetric defense is not only about the military, civil resistance and whole of society resilience would be decisive. Taiwan is training in civilians to support defense and maintain critical infrastructure and keep the nation functioning under attack. Supplies are stockpiled and civilian communication networks prepared to operate despite disruptions. Together, these asymmetric options would provide Taiwan with the means to resist longer than by simply trying to match China's means. Taiwan would not need to defeat China outright. It would only need to make the invasion so costly, uncertain, and prolonged that Beijing concluded the risk is not worth the reward. And so, based on this, Taiwan is aiming to deter China from invading and prepare for an invasion. Taiwan is actively implementing policy procurement, organizational reform, and civilian readiness. More specifically, Taiwan has allocated a special defense budget of 1.25 trillion Taiwanese dollars phased through 2033, especially aiming at enhancing asymmetric capabilities and resilience. President Lai Ching-te has pledged to raise the overall defense spending to around 5% of the GDP by 2030 to support this effort. In this context, Taiwan is mass producing anti-ship missiles under its Sea-Air Combat Power Improvement Plan. It is also scaling up drone production with a target of 200,000 units annually by 2030 to build a deep inventory of cheap expendable systems. And it is procuring HIMARS, drones, and integrated tactical networks through recent US arms deals. The island is also developing a T-dome integrated air defense system to improve sensor-to-shooter integration and interception rates. At the same time, Taipei is acquiring anti-drone systems and training in drone interception, overall enhancing its readiness to counter gray zone and hybrid coercive tactics, which are aggressive, damaging actions taken deliberately but that are kept below the threshold of conventional war. On the Navy side, Taipei is accelerating the indigenous development of submarines and Tuochang-class missile corvettes, optimized for coastal defense and sea denial. Furthermore, Taipei has transformed its mandatory conscription for young men, expanding service from 4 months to a year to boost readiness and reserve capability. And it has further increased training with asymmetric doctrine, coastal defense, and joint operations with allies. Taiwan conducts large-scale urban defense drills integrating military units, reservists, and civilian volunteers to simulate wartime conditions. National campaigns to distribute civil defense handbooks and prepare households for emergencies. And in Taipei itself, you can see many signs in the street pointing to shelters in case of an aerial attack on the city. Finally, whole of society program focused on stockpiling, infrastructure hardening, and civilian emergency response planning are put in place. The overarching intent of Taiwan's asymmetric preparation is deterrence by denial, convincing Beijing that any attempt to seize Taiwan would neither be quick or cheap. This aligns with Taiwan's defensive geography, technological capability, and geographic constraints. But what Taiwan lacks and cannot be easily replaced is strategic depth. The island is narrow. Its port, air bases, and cities lie within range of Chinese missiles. Most of them are actually facing mainland China. This reality leads to a crucial conclusion drawn by multiple Wargames. There is no Ukrainian model for Taiwan. Unlike Ukraine, Taiwan cannot rely on land borders to sustain a long war. If conflict begins, its survival will depend on what can reach it by sea and under fire. One thing plays in Taiwan's advantage. Amphibious invasions are the most difficult and risky operations because they force an attacker to project combat power to land while fully exposed to a prepared defender. Defending forces benefit from fixed positions, obstacles, and clear fields of fire, while assaulting troops arrive slowly, disorganized, and without cover, creating an immediate tactical disadvantage. The logistical challenge is immense, moving thousands and thousands of soldiers, armor, fuel, and ammunition from ships to shore, often without usable ports, requiring specialized landing craft, precise timing, and sustained resupply under fire. Command and control are severely limited in the initial phases, generating frictions as units struggle to regroup and push inland. Success depends on extraordinary coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, as well as weather, tides, and geography, all of which can undermine even well-planned operations. History illustrates both extremes. Disasters like Gallipoli and Dieppe reveal the cost of attacking prepared defenses with inadequate planning, intelligence failures, and a severe underestimation of the defender's advantage in amphibious warfare. On the other hand, World War II's D-Day shows that a success is possible only through overwhelming resources, extensive training, deception, and the neutralization of enemy threats during the vulnerable transit and landing phases. So at the core, logistics is the problem. How can an island be supplied in time of war? In the Taiwan conflict, any external support must cross the sea. Military analysts often compare this challenge to one historical case, Malta in World War II. Between 1940 and 1943, Allied convoys repeatedly forced their way through an Axis blockade to resupply the island. Many were destroyed, some turned back, but enough got through because the strategic necessity outweighed the cost. Taiwan presents a similar problem under modern conditions. If the Philippines and Japan remain neutral, the only viable route lies eastward across the Philippine Sea, a journey more than 2,600 kilometers from Guam. If Japan participates, the Ryukyu island chain, or Okinawa, would allow escorts and air cover to approach within 200 kilometers of Taiwan, a decisive difference. And ports matter just as much. Taiwan has 8 major ports, but only 2 of the large ports are on the east. But even these remain vulnerable to missiles and airstrikes. Trains, rail lines, fuel depot are all exposed. Defending them requires scarce air defense resources that is also needed elsewhere. On the other hand, China's options to interdict supply convoys and enforce the blockades are numerous. Submarines pose the most persistent threats, difficult to detect and hard to deter, and China operates dozens. Missiles add another layer. Cruise missiles and anti-ship ballistic missiles are strong threats to supply convoys. And air power remains a factor, particularly long-range bombers launching salvos from outside defending envelopes. Surface fleets, while powerful, are less likely to lead convoy attacks early on, constrained by geography and Taiwan's own anti-ship weapons. The result is likely to be a war of attrition. History suggests a sobering lesson. It is extremely difficult to stop a decimated maritime supply altogether, but it is very costly to keep it going. Today's Ukraine maritime drone attacks on Russian fleet in the Black Sea show also how cheap it can be to destroy very expensive ships, and that strategy can be used by both China and Taiwan to their own advantage. Let's now examine what China is doing to gain control over Taiwan. Over the past decade, and with accelerating intensity since 2022, the People's Republic of China has undertaken a systematic, documented buildup of military capabilities, doctrine, and political signaling that align closely with the requirements of a coercive campaign or invasion across the Taiwan Strait. At the strategic level, Beijing has embedded bringing Taiwan under its control into its national security doctrine. The US Defense Department has in recent years explicitly assessed that the People's Liberation Army, PLA, that is the Chinese army, is being modernized to provide credible military options against Taiwan, ranging from coercive pressure and blockade to full-scale amphibious invasion. These reports describe a force that is no longer regionally focused, but joint, integrated, and increasingly capable of high-intensity, multi-domain operations. The most visible manifestation of this buildup is in the naval and amphibious domain. The PLA Navy has grown into the world's largest by whole count, with hundreds of surface combatants, submarines, and auxiliaries, and a rapidly expanding amphibious fleet of landing ships. Pentagon projections show the PLA Navy approaching roughly over 430 ships by 2030. At the same time, China has begun systematically integrating civilian roll on roll off ferries and cargo ships into military exercises, practicing loading armored vehicles and troops for cross strait transport. Reuters investigations and Taiwanese reporting confirm that this civilian shadow fleet is intended to close the gap between China's dedicated amphibious lift and the massing force required for a real invasion. Air and missile power form the second pillar of this preparation. The PLA Air Force and Rocket Force have expanded both capacity and readiness for Taiwan scenario. Hundreds of short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic and cruise missiles are now oriented towards the island and US bases in the Western Pacific. These systems are designed to suppress air defenses, destroy ports, and hold external interveners at risk. Parallel to this, China has normalized an unprecedented operational tempo around Taiwan with thousands of PLA aircraft sorties into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, each year. Frequent crossing of the Taiwan Strait median line and routine multi-axis patrol from the north, west, and south. What began as signaling has become a standing pattern of operations that conditions Chinese forces for sustained combat air and maritime presence around the island. These capabilities are reinforced by doctrine and training. The PLA has restructured itself around integrated joint operations, binding the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force, as well as strategic support forces, into a single war-fighting system. Exercises such as the Joint Sword Series and Justice Mission 2025 have rehearsed precisely the kind of operations required for a Taiwan campaign, which is joint firepower strikes, air-sea coordination, anti-submarine warfare, and maritime control around the island. Critically, these drills are no longer confined to the Taiwan Strait. They increasingly encircle Taiwan, reflecting a shift toward blockade and isolation scenarios rather than a simple confrontational crossing. Together, these developments form a coherent invasion architecture. In a conflict, China would probably first seek to exploit this buildup in a phased campaign. The opening move would likely not be a sudden mass landing, but a strategic paralysis operation. Rocket Force missiles and long-range air strikes would attempt to blind Taiwan by destroying radar sites, air bases, and command centers. Cyber and electronic warfare would target communication and data network, while ADIZ air-style operation would transition into combat air patrols and strike packages. The goal would be to seize air and information superiority, denying Taiwan and its partners the ability to coordinate an effective response. Simultaneously, the PLA Navy would move to impose a de facto blockade. Surface combatants, submarines, and maritime patrol aircraft would control the approaches to Taiwan's ports, while exercises that have rehearsed encirclement would become real interdiction operations. This phase would seek to cut Taiwan off from fuel, food, and military resupply, testing whether the island could be coerced into submission without a landing. After this campaign and without Taiwan submitting, China would probably attempt a forcible entry. Amphibious assault ships and civilian ferries protected by destroyers, frigates, and air cover would cross the strait in waves, aiming for a small number of suitable beaches and ports. Airborne forces would attempt to see key terrain and infrastructure inland. Rocket and artillery fires would support the landing, striking Taiwanese reserves and logistics hubs to prevent an organized counterattack. Yet, despite this formidable build-up, the very scale and complexity of such operation reveal why invasions remain extraordinarily difficult. Amphibious warfare is the most demanding form of military operation. Even with hundreds of ships, China still lacks enough secure lift to rapidly transport and sustain the hundreds of thousands of troops required to conquer and hold Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait is a narrow, heavily defended kill zone where ships must operate under missile, mine, submarine, and air attack. A blockade requires persistent dominance of air and sea space, something that becomes exponentially harder if the US and its allies intervene. And this is why China has invested so heavily in these incursions and large-scale exercises. They are not only political pressure, they are a rehearsal of the real thing. Each sortie, each joint drill, each civilian shipping experiment is a building block of a campaign designed to isolate, paralyze, and overwhelm Taiwan before a single soldier steps on the island. In short, the PLA's growing capabilities are not random modernization, they form a deliberate integrated invasion system. Missiles to blind and suppress, air and naval forces to isolate and dominate, amphibious and civilian shipping to deliver mass, and joint doctrine to bind it all together. Whether Beijing ultimately chooses to use the system is a political decision, but militarily, the architecture for a Taiwan campaign is being assembled in plain sight. One key factor that could impact this political decision is the lack of experience of the PLA in military combat, let alone in an amphibious invasion. Alongside this military buildup, China is waging a sustained political warfare campaign to weaken Taiwan from within. This effort blends disinformation, espionage, economic coercion, and influence operations into a single strategy designed to fracture the Taiwanese society and undermine confidence in resistance. Chinese state media, online troll farms, and coordinated social media networks regularly amplify narratives that portray unification as inevitable, the United States as unreliable, and Taiwan's government as corrupt or reckless, while spreading false stories during elections and crises to polarize voters and erode trust in democratic institutions. At the same time, Chinese intelligence services recruit Taiwanese military personnel, civil servants, and business figures for espionage, seeking access to war plans, mobilization procedures, and critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. Economic pressure, tourism restrictions, and targeted trade measures are used to punish political choices in Taipei and reward pro Beijing actors, reinforcing the message that resistance carries a cost. Together, these non-kinetic tools aim to soften Taiwan before a conflict, weaken its will to fight, and create internal divisions that China could exploit during a blockade or invasion, reducing the need for force and increasing the odds that any military campaign succeeds quickly. So, what are war games telling us? Well, to understand the stakes, a major series of war games were conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, examining a Chinese invasion under dozens of scenarios. Their finding is consistent and grim. In most cases, Taiwan survives only if it resists immediately. The United States and Japan must intervene early, and losses are catastrophic on all sides. The scenarios see 2 to 4 US aircraft carriers lost, 10,000s of casualties, Taiwan's economy devastated, and China's legitimacy shaken internally. And there is no quick victory for anyone. So deterrence, therefore, will be the key to prevent such a scenario. And it is not depending only on weapons, but also and mainly on political will in China and Taiwan, but also in the region and Washington. But today, Taiwan is critical, especially in the semiconductor sector, but also geographically, with a lot of global shipping going through the Taiwan Strait. Taking control of Taiwan would provide China with a strategic advantage, first line of projection, and military power projection. These reasons have led Japan to recognize that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would constitute a national security threat to the country. And Washington is also wary of China's expanding its sea control power and enhancing anti-access area denial capability. But Taiwan will struggle to escort supply convoys themselves while defending its own shores. Its recent shift towards lighter asymmetric forces strengthens defense, but it weakens long-range escort capacity. Furthermore, its central dilemma today is that military strategy is inseparable from political commitment. And under Trump's administration, the US political commitment is far from secure. But the clearer the commitment is, the stronger deterrence becomes. Ambiguity buys time, but it also invites miscalculations. And unfortunately, we have a timeline. Beijing gave itself a 2027 deadline to bring Taiwan under its control. If this happens, it will happen under Donald Trump's presidency, which definitely will weaken Taiwan's deterrence. But the world needs to recognize the importance of not allowing another imperialistic push that is devastating Ukraine and Palestine today to affect yet another region in the world. A war over Taiwan would not only be a regional conflict, it would be a global rupture because of its impact on supply chains, power balance, and challenge of international law. For now, peace endures not because the problem is solved, but because all sides still believe the cost of war is too high. The challenge of the coming years is to keep it that way. This will depend heavily on signaling and making political commitments to protect the island. The US is the biggest wildcard here. Its commitment to Ukraine was shaken, and this can send the wrong signal to China. Could other countries, such as Japan, compensate for this lack of commitment from Washington? Putin bet against the West coming to Ukraine's defense, and Taiwan needs to convince Beijing that it doesn't want to make the same mistake, but they are running against time. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. I always link the sources in the description, and I hope to see you soon for a new video. Bye!